I don't know if that's necessarily a 4-star. Maybe it's 3.5. Maybe it's 3. Maybe it's 2.5. I have different feelings about this. Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be doing the Asian Readathon wrap-up because I finished all my prompts and I was really proud of myself, except for the fact that I did most of my reading in that first week. If you didn't see that vlog, I mean, you can go see it and you can get my initial reactions, but these are more thoughtful answers for, how I felt about them. I'm still a little conflicted about a couple of these, but anyway, here we go. So, the first one that I read was the group read, which was 1,000 Beginnings and Endings. And I was going to try to break down, how I felt about each one of these stories, but I found a table of contents, because I did this on audiobook, as always. But I found a table of contents, and I was, trying to remember what everything was, and I found that largely, it didn't make an impact on me all that much. There were a few that really stuck out in my head, and the rest of them, I guess, I don't know, it kind of glossed over, and I don't remember anything specific or, especially just by the title, what these were about. So yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the ones that really stuck out in my head and why I connect to these specifically. So the first one is the first one of the book, which is Forbidden Fruit by Roshani Chokshi. I was reading something else by her, Gilded Wolves, also this month. So I feel like I got a feel for her type of writing. And then Gilded Wolves was completely different, so I think that she's a very versatile writer, which is really quite nice. This fairy tale it felt like less of a retelling and more of a straight up a version of this ancient fairy tale, which was totally fine. I don't know if that was necessarily what the point of this short story collection was, and perhaps that's the reason why it was the first one, but I think it was really well done. It was a really interesting concept of, sort of a forbidden marriage and jealousy and misunderstanding and really naive innocence as well. It was a nice tale. It didn't feel like it tried to reinvent the wheel too much. I know that the little afterword by Chokshi said that she wanted to put this in a slightly different light than what is traditionally showed, and I think that she did that quite well. But again, it didn't feel like it was a groundbreaking retelling of this story. That's not to say that it's bad, it wasn't quite what I was expecting on that. I still enjoyed it, very much so. Second one is Olivia's Table by Alyssa Wong. And this one was much more of what I was expecting for this short story series, which is a cultural connection or a myth or something along those lines put in a completely different setting and perhaps in even a modern day setting. And that definitely was what Olivia's Table was. It has to do with the Ghost Festival, which is a Chinese tradition in which this young lady is going to an old mining town in Arizona where there was a lot of Chinese immigration, and she's there to cook a gigantic feast for the ghosts. Her mother used to do this, and so once her mother has passed on, she's sort of keeping the tradition alive, and she's trying to connect with not only her mother who's passed, but also it ends up being this other ghost that she saw and who saved her pretty much as a child. There's a lot of this intergenerational connection to something that perhaps is lost, not just culturally, but people as well. There's also a feeling of moving on, which I like all these themes, so this one was a particular win for me. I honestly think that it's probably my favorite story of the whole collection. And the last one that I wanted to talk about is Still Star-Crossed by...
Hi, Editor Yumi here, and first off, I'm not gonna have you sit and hear me butcher the name. It's Sona Charapatra. That is the name of this wonderful woman who did a wonderful job. Also, I'm just gonna do the rest of the review right here because I'm editing this and it's terrible. This story is definitely about love. It's about also family and traditions and sort of, I wouldn't say the breaking of those traditions, but definitely the changing of the traditions. So we have a festival, and our main character meets a boy who thinks that she's someone else, and there are little connections here and there from what her mother has said and what she's familiar with. She doesn't get into a romantic relationship right away, but there's very much this intrigue. Later on, a week or so later, she's working in her mom's shop, and her mother then has a discussion about love and family and essentially arranged marriages and perhaps this secret love affair that her mother once had. And then we get to see the boy again from the celebration. It's hinted at that this boy is actually perhaps a spirit of her mother's lover who's come back and sort of mistaken her for the mom. The little afterword also has this idea of souls that are destined to meet each other, in either reincarnated states or every generation. And so it was a rather short story in comparison to some of the other ones, but it did everything that it needed to do. It was definitely a retelling. It was something that discussed the modernization. Again, I appreciated that. I felt like it didn't do too much, and the point of it was very clear. So that I think that's the reason why it sort of stuck out in my head, and it felt good to listen to and to read. I think that's all for this one. So get on with the rest of the video. Thanks.
Yeah, I think those were my big highlights for this short story collection. Ultimately, I gave this book 3 stars. I'm wavering between 3 and 3.5. I feel like this was a really good collection of short stories, and it gave you a broad spectrum of different cultures and different myths and legends within the Asian community, but at the same time, I wasn't 100% sold on all of them. And I don't know if it had to do with what essentially the prompt was, or if it was how it was portrayed, especially in the audiobook. I kind of want to go back at some point and read it in the physical, see if my mind changes at all, but that will have to wait until I figure out how to get that book. Next one that I read, because I was trying to pace myself through a bunch of emotions that I thought I was going to be feeling, and I was going to give myself a day between finishing 1,000 Beginnings and Endings and reading The Boat, but I didn't, and I slightly regret that choice. The Boat was heavy and informative and heartbreaking and entirely necessary for people to read, in my opinion. I do want to read the actual, I guess it's a short story collection, or the narrative of The Boat by May, not just the graphic novel. I gave the graphic novel 4 stars because there were some parts that just didn't work. I was distracted, or I passed a certain point and I couldn't, things broke away and I couldn't get back to it to see what I had missed. It wasn't that big of a deal, but it was enough to make me not absolutely die-hard love this. There were a few other choices, there were side stories or more information where we'd come to the end of a section and then there would be a little icon, say, for this story, click here, and then it would bring you to a different sort of screen and give you a different side story and information. And then once you were done with that, it went right back to where you were to begin with, and then you just continued. I feel like those should have just been included and not a choice whether or not you saw those things. One, because the one side story of a character, it really brought together her storyline and why she was so oddly protective and letting go of her child, and how that worked on her psyche as they were all suffering and people were dying, and how that affected her relationship with the main character. I don't feel like she would have made sense if you hadn't gotten that story, and if you didn't choose to take that side option, you may have missed it entirely, and I don't think that should have been an option. Furthermore, if you aren't familiar or perhaps have certain feelings about fleeing as a refugee and then trying to survive long enough where you find your destination, that break off in particular of why people were leaving, how people were leaving, and how many drove, all of the really gritty details, it would give you, or it could possibly leave you with a different impression of why people do choose to flee their country, and in particular why the Vietnamese of that era did. So again, this will be something I'll have to go back to and really read through the short story version of this and see how it compares, because I would really like to see that. It didn't seem like the creators of this interactive graphic novel were doing the book injustice. They seem to take the subject and the material and the stories very seriously. While I feel like they could have made different choices as far as how it was presented, I did feel like it was very good. After that depressing episode, I decided to pick up the Gilded Wolves, and I have feelings about the Gilded Wolves. First off, I wasn't expecting this to be written as it was, considering I had read Roshani Chakshi's short story before. But of course, you know, it's short stories, novels, every different type of novel is going to be different. So I don't know why I was expecting the pacing and the language to be similar, but here we are. Gilded Wolves is about a group of people who are coming together to steal objects of power and prestige, forged items, as it were. There is a secret society involved, families who possess a map to something greater and bigger and more important than these forged items, and a sort of revenge plot to get back something that was stolen from our main character, namely his family fortune and status. We have neurodiverse representation. We have colorism that is touched up upon. There is cultural appropriation, which is touched up upon, and all in the context of 18th, 19th century, I would say 19th century, honestly, France, which was interesting and cool. But yeah, there was a lot of very surface level things going on with this book, which I'm not unhappy to have seen, but ultimately I think that perhaps there was too much. I couldn't help but compare it to Six of Crows, and having heard a couple other people's reaction to it, I'm trying not to compare the two. I'm really trying hard not to, but it's hard when you're like, oh, these characters align, and these characters align, and these characters align, and then this other random other thing aligns too. Parallels are a little too hard to not see. That said, it didn't really detract any of my enjoyment from the book. It was just something that was gnawing at the back of my brain this entire time that I was trying really hard to ignore. I think the only thing that really sold the whole thing for me was Zofia, who is our neurodiverse character and who also deals with anti-Semitism, as she is Jewish. She's a very smart individual, but she is autistic. It's not explicitly said so, but there's a lot of very telltale signs of high-functioning autism, and that is what she has. That is something that she deals with, but it's never in a negative light. It's just, this is how she is, and this is how she deals with it. And she's very much included. In fact, she is a romantic interest for one of the other characters, and that I feel like that was a really good thing. She also, I think, was the just straight up smartest character of the entire book, and I'm not just talking about like book smart. Everyone else was very emotional or had their flaws that got in the way, and she was like, screw that most of the time. Obviously they're still young adults, and that's not going to hold true for every single encounter, but she deals with everything with as much poise and grace as she can muster, and I really, really enjoyed that. I would never, ever, ever in a million years recommend you get this audiobook, ever. There were two narrators. There was a male narrator and a female narrator. And the male narrator, in particular, was terrible. Just inflections in the wrong part of the sentences, bad French accents, no emotion. Yeah. The female narrator was a little bit better, but there were still weird inflections and weird accents. Never, don't do it. This is probably one of the worst audiobooks that I have listened to. That said, if you want to skip to the end, there was an interview with Roshani Chakshi with her between her and her editor, and that was actually quite nice to hear and like hear her voice and hear her perspectives on all these different aspects. So that was like I think the best part of the audiobook and probably the saving grace for my time spent listening to it. It's definitely a 3-star read, because anything less would be unfair. I don't think that I'm going to read the next book, unfortunately, just because the pacing of this book was a little weird, and I think that the ending of their adventure, it felt like a CW TV show where like the last episode or two in any given season just like gives you a cliffhanger for the next season so that you come back. And I was not a fan of that. I'm curious as to what happens, but I wish I would have gotten that before this point. Beyond all of the other things that I was not a fan of, I don't understand why it was called the Gilded Wolves. The only time that Gilded Wolves made an appearance was after the heist, after the all is lost moment, and in essentially the denouement and into the cliffhanger for next season, there is a single party in which the entire party is covered in gilded wolves. I feel like it should have probably been called the Bone Clock, not the Gilded Wolves. I don't feel like the all is lost moment, the turn after the heist, you know, that moment when they're trying to get paid but then they get actually swindled, that kind of part of the heist. I feel like that part wasn't earned enough. We're so focused on the characters interacting with each other and, you know, the love interest, the flirts, the whether or not our main character is going to get his family, you know, fame, fortune, prestige back, that the turn kind of comes out of nowhere. And there were hints, yes, but it wasn't hinted well enough and it wasn't set up well enough, especially in regards to this world. And after having listened to the setup for the end, I feel like that part could have been integrated before pretty easily, actually. And that way the turn would have felt a little bit more prominent and necessary and perhaps a little bit more impactful. And then the last turn at the end would have also been earned, not sure. I enjoyed pieces of this book, but I didn't enjoy it enough to keep going with the series. I'm between 2 and 3 stars, but I think that giving it 2 stars is unfair and disingenuous, so 3 it is. After that, I decided to do 1,000 Miles of Freedom, which I did almost in one day because I had a doctor's appointment, and we all know how doctor's appointments go, especially when we're talking about waiting at the doctor's. I thought that I was going to be a lot more depressed than I was. Yunsin Kim went through some shit, and what she went through was detailed out just enough where I could empathize with her and her struggle, and made me really understand why she left and her choices that her and her family made, and why honestly she wrote this book. I was surprised to find that I wasn't like completely bawling in a corner, you know, trying to hide my tears in the doctor's office kind of thing. For someone who has survived as much as she has and has seen as much suffering and starvation and disease and just the utter disgusting nature of human beings, she is surprisingly optimistic. And I hope that the world doesn't break her ever, because we need more people like her in the world, or at least the way that she presents herself in the book. Honestly, the pacing of the book is such that just as we're getting into something horrible and heavy and really distressing, we get a moment of reprieve where she reminds us that she has survived this, that she's a healthy and happy South Korean citizen now, and that she's had an amazing adventure afterwards, you know, because she wants to help the people in her country. She also sort of reminds us in very, very subtle ways that even though this hurt them deeply, and it's something that she'll never forget, she also reminds us that this isn't just her story, it's many people's stories. She's told her story in order to bring awareness to things that are happening to other people. I gave this 5 stars because this was not what I was expecting. I was expecting this to be more like, this was a while ago, but if you've ever read The Child Called It, which is a horrible, depressing account of child abuse and just a failure of the social working system and just horrible humans being horrible. It wasn't as depressing as that. It ended so hopeful. I was expecting to fall into like this huge state of depression, but I didn't, and I was very surprised about that. And also I feel like because this is her retelling, her account of her own story, it's hard for me as a person who could have easily been in her position, you know, given a different set of circumstances, to give this story anything less than a full 5 stars. I think also that her goal in writing and publishing and getting this book translated into many different languages, you know, to spread awareness about what is happening, to try to bring more help to the situation. I think that she started her path by doing all this, and she's really done a great job. I understand that also this was the prompt where we're trying to read something that was translated from the original language. So there's some things that I'm sure were not translated correctly, and perhaps the original has a different tone, but I need to praise the translation and the translator for bringing us just enough, pretty much enough of everything. There was enough hope, there was enough tragedy, there was enough empathy that was gained, and there was enough juxtaposition between her life now and her life as a child in North Korea, you know, almost dying of starvation. This was a very profound read for me, and I think that of the books that I read for Asian Readathon, this one was my favorite. So I have lots of good things to say about it, and go read the book if you haven't. I honestly do think that it's an important read, much like The Boat, but in a different way. And the last one that I read, which took me a long time because I don't know how much I really liked this or didn't like it, and I was very confused. And then I watched the live show for The Astonishing Color of After, and I was even more confused about how I felt, but here we go, The Astonishing Color of After. I want to work this out with you, if you will let me. So, The Astonishing Color of After, on Goodreads, I gave it a 4 stars. I don't know if that's necessarily a 4-star. Maybe it's 3.5, maybe it's 3, maybe it's 2.5. I have different feelings about this. So, The Astonishing Color of After, if you have not read it, is about a half Taiwanese, half white American girl who has just lost her mother to suicide. They have the funeral, and she is going through, you know, grief and loss and depression herself, and then she finds this gigantic red bird that she believes is her mother. She gets this box from this bird that has a bunch of photos and things, and the bird says that it's from Lee, is the main character. It's from Lee's grandparents in Taiwan, who Lee has never met. So Lee and her father go to Taiwan, and Lee is on this quest to find her mother. That sounds amazing on its face value, and I'm not going to say that it didn't touch me or it didn't do, I think, what it intended to do, but I don't think that what the book ultimately did was good enough. We're dealing a lot with the way a teenager is dealing with the loss of her mother, and she's trying to work out why her mother would take her own life. What was the root cause of her depression? The author, Emily X. Rappan, did say that she wanted the cause of the depression to kind of remain nebulous. She didn't want there to be like a definitive reason why. Her older sister had died, and she felt like for whatever reason it was her fault, and there wasn't really a reason for her to think that, but depression isn't necessarily logical. So we have that connection to perhaps when it started, but as to why therapy isn't working, why drugs aren't working, and why ultimately she felt so terrible and distraught that taking her own life was like the only way to end her suffering, that feeling is not explained or really explored. I appreciate that, but we don't get closure that way. And additionally, when we tried to get closure through the bird, first off, the bird hardly makes an appearance after like the first 10% of the book. It's not really a prominent figure. There are a lot of things that the book very lightly touches up upon, but then never goes into more depth. And also understanding that there is a lot to unpack, not just dealing with a suicide of a parent, not just dealing with a disconnect from a culture, not just fighting grief, not just being in a foreign country with a language that you don't quite understand, uncovering your past and your family's past, and not just dealing with general things of being a teenager, like, finding love and having things change and having an unsupportive parent. There's so much in this, and I feel like this needed to scale back on the topics that it touched. If this was going to be more than one book, I think that we could have touched upon all of these and would have been fine, and we could have had deeper conversations about all of these things. But because it is a standalone, it doesn't feel like it was paced out correctly. And ultimately, it kind of fails at what it wants to do. Now, that's not to say that this was necessarily a bad book. I can understand exactly why people would latch onto this, to feel represented and seen. Like, Lee's family feels like parts of my own family. I'm half Japanese and half white American, and I can't speak Japanese because my grandparents, though they grew up in Japan and are fluent in, both English and Japanese, the thought was, you're American now, you're in America, you speak English. I tried going to Japanese school from the time that I was 5, on Saturdays. I went to Saturday school, and it's not the same when one day a week you get Japanese that's mostly taught in English and having it spoken at home. Things sort of make sense to me, but there's a lot of things that you just forget. If you don't use it, you lose it. For me personally, there are a lot of stories that I know are there in my family's history that no one speaks about, because in Asian cultures, we don't talk about our mental health and our feelings and things that we're struggling with, even though we all definitely know it's there. To bring this into my own family's history, I know that my grandmother was in Hiroshima when the bomb dropped, and yet I have never heard my grandmother speak about it. She almost pretends like her life started when she came to America and Japan didn't exist. I also know that she lost her first child. She was born during the polio scare, and they misdiagnosed her, so she was being treated for the wrong thing, and she died of, I believe it was a lung infection. It was weird because stumbling across old pictures is kind of how I found out that I was supposed to have an aunt, and I came across this picture of my bachan with a baby, and I asked, "Is that Dad?" And she takes the picture and she says no, and she puts it away. There's definitely family history. Woo. There's definitely family history that I don't know because we don't talk about it. Going back to Japan the very first time when I was a child and looking back on my memories, there's a lot of things that are and are not said, but you are strangely aware of what is happening and how people are treated differently. I didn't feel it so much as a child. I was a very, very brown-haired child, and it's weird having large eyes, you know, over there. It's weird having the body that I do, which is slightly overweight and large-chested. I feel like I'm on display. There's a lot of the cultural backing that just by surface level talking about, I felt very deeply. But that's because those are my own emotions and my own experiences that I am projecting onto the book, and I know this. So this is making it difficult for me to give this like a real definitive star rating. I'm between 3 and 4 stars because I don't think it was terrible. I think that it was not the book it could have been, and perhaps this should have been several different stories or several different books, I'm not sure which, instead of this one novel. I am curious to see what else Emily X.R. Pan does come out with, and I think that I'll see how she progresses in the future. I think it was Cindy from Read with Cindy. She had said this definitely felt like a debut author, and I would have to agree. It wasn't bad. It was definitely more rough than I was expecting, but it wasn't terrible. After all of that, and all the emotion and everything, that was my Asian Readathon month. I don't know, I did this because I feel like I don't have a huge variety in my my reading. I tend to lean toward what's popular, what's in my purview, my genre reading, and so expanding what it is that I read, what books, you know, I end up picking up felt good. I missed short stories, so that the group read was quite nice, but I feel like for the month I didn't 100% enjoy the readathon because of the books that I chose. I definitely was not expecting to enjoy 1,000 Miles to Freedom as much as I did, and I'm glad that that was my 5-star read, but I was expecting to, you know, to enjoy the Gilded Wolves a little bit more. I definitely was expecting to enjoy the Astonishing Call of After a lot more than I did. So I felt like part of my readathon was very disappointing, but it was also very surprising, like a good surprising in other ways. So yeah, I guess that's my wrap up for May, my Asian Readathon. And hopefully I'll remember to actually do these wrap-ups, you know, not just for readathons and stuff like that. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Again, this is probably gonna be a long video. I apologize for that, but thank you for sticking around and watching till the end. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell down below if you haven't already for content that will be definitely better than this. And share this video, share the other videos that you think other people would enjoy, because we're getting there. We're getting to 100. I want to do the giveaway. Like, please let me give you free shit. Yeah, I will see you in the next video then. All right, bye.
She said it will never go away. I know there is nothing left to say. Can we try to hold on just for now, even if we don't know how to show them what we're all about?